Of all modern cultures, the Chinese offer the longest continuous past and the most copious written record of their past. It is all the more remarkable, then, that a modern historical consciousness did not develop in China. The Chinese way of filtering the past, although different from the Hindu, was hardly better designed to awaken people to social change or the power of mankind to transform institutions. Confucianism, rooted in ancestor worship, encouraged record keeping for genealogies. The Confucian consulted the past not to learn how institutions could be changed, but rather to find the ideal to which they should be restored, and for models of virtue to be imitated. Anecdotes collected in the early feudal period were sanctified by attribution to Confucius himself. Then, in the beginning of the imperial period, in the second century BC, Sima Xian, 145 to around 87 BC, set the pattern for historical writing in China for the next 2,000 years. His father was astrologer royal, or grand scribe of the Han court, with the duty of keeping the calendar and recording official events. When Sima Xian inherited the office in 108 BC, the Han dynasty had begun the political unification of all China. He carried on his father's efforts to bring together the records of all the Chinese people into a single work. Such a compilation would celebrate the great achievement of the ambitious new dynasty, bent on a new beginning, marked by a reform of the calendar, which Sima Xian helped inaugurate. A single imprudent word was enough to ruin his life. Once, after the general Li Ling had lost a great and bloody battle, quote, "The emperor could find no favor in his food and no delight in the deliberations of his court," end of quote. The other generals met in an imperial council to commiserate on the defeat and put the blame on Li Ling. But Sima Xian considered him a paragon of loyalty and of virtue, and believed the battle had been lost despite Li Ling's bravery. When called into the imperial council, Sima Xian, by his own account, quote, took the chance to speak of Li Ling's merits, hoping to broaden his majesty's view and put a stop to the angry words of the other officials, end of quote. For these ill-considered remarks, he was thrown into prison, accused of defaming the emperor, for which the penalty was death. Quote, "My family was poor," Sima Xian explained, "and lacked sufficient funds to buy commutation of sentence," end of quote. Xian begged a reprieve so that he could finish compiling his history. The emperor, reluctant to lose so expert and energetic an astrologer royal, graciously ordered that instead of being executed, Xian should be castrated. In shamefaced retirement, Xian completed his history, which became the model for all major chronicles of the Chinese past until the end of the imperial period in 1911. Before him, each Chinese state had used its own chronology, with the result that there was no way of knowing which events in the different states were contemporary. Xian brought all these together in a single time series around the chronology of the ruling house of Zhou. He also offered a new topical framework divided into 5 sections: basic annals, or the lives of men who ruled large areas; chronological tables; treatises on political, economic, social, and cultural themes; hereditary houses; and biographies of important men who were not rulers, but who illustrated eminence and virtue. Xian's style made him a classic, but instead of emulating his spirit, disciples imitated his form. His immediate successor, Pan Ku, AD 32 to 92, froze Xian's pattern into a rigid Confucian mold, leaving no leeway for interpretation. With the reunification of China under the Tang dynasty in the 7th century, the making of standard histories in the genre of Xian and under the complacent euphemism of veritable records became a permanent task of the growing national bureaucracy. All versions of the official national history were, of course, government property. For a while, they were public, but before long, they were secreted in government archives accessible to only a few. Each successive dynasty came to consider it a duty to compile a history of the preceding dynasty, leaving the history of their own time to be written by their successors. The writing of standard histories continued to be governed by contradictory ideals: truthful record versus appropriate concealment, objectivity versus ethical instruction. The whole Chinese past, incorporated into the Confucian tradition, became part of the apparatus of government. A history office was established in the Tang Dynasty and thereafter controlled all the accessible past. For millennia, Chinese history was written by bureaucrats and for bureaucrats. There was a brief revival of Xian's lively spirit in the remarkable Song Dynasty, but the revival of Neo-Confucian orthodoxy under the Ming, that's 1368 to 1644, kept the past still firmly frozen in Xian's mold. The collapse of the Ming and the conquest by the Manchu did open some cracks, but the few notable efforts to write the critical history in the 18th century were conspicuous exceptions. Critical techniques in the writing of history and the rise of historical consciousness would have to await the influence of the West. In this, as in so many other ways, Chinese civilization suffered from its antiquity, its precocity, and its continuity. The greatness of ancient models, the unbroken series of records, and the early effectiveness of central government all reinforced reverence for ancestors and stifled efforts to look at the unauthorized vistas of the past or to speculate on what might have been. The story of history in the West was dramatically different. The kind of history invented here would eventually reshape the lives and institutions of the peoples of India, the Middle East, Islam, and China. Western exploration of the past was as momentous as the charting of New World continents and the exploration of the oceans. Here again, the story begins in the mystery of the Greek inquiring spirit. For the Greeks made of the past something quite different from that seen from India or China. Greek mythology, the most familiar survival of Greek culture, is not the most distinctive expression of the Greek view of the past. One of the greatest Greek inventions was the idea of history. The word history, along with its cognates in European languages, derives through the Latin historia from the word historie, which the Greeks used to mean inquiry or knowing by inquiry. Its original meaning survives in the expression natural history, for inquiry into nature. And this characteristic Greek notion of inquiry bore fruit in the 6th century BC in the Ionian Enlightenment. We think of modern scientists as the heirs of that spirit, but so too are modern historians. Perhaps it was a byproduct of their study of medicine, which observed how the functioning of the body varied with environment, climate, and diet, and so led the Greeks to wonder about the varying ways of communities. Hecataeus of Miletus, circa 550 to 489 BC, one of the first and best-known pioneers of Greek historical writing, compiled genealogies and scrutinized the legends of the great mythical families. Quote, "What I write here," he insisted, "is the account of what I considered to be true. For the stories of the Greeks are numerous and, in my opinion, ridiculous." End of quote. Traveling widely, Hecataeus noted the varieties of customs and saw a connection between where people lived and how they lived. In this way, he helped develop the Greek cosmopolitan awareness of the relation between geography and history. Before the spread of typographic printing, as we have seen, verse, a convenient and pleasant vehicle of memory, was the customary format for the transmission of countless prosaic facts, skills, and traditions, from the rules of grammar or of morals to the articles of religious faith and the adventures of folk heroes. Poetry, not prose, was the primitive form for storing the community's memory. When Greek writers of the Ionian Enlightenment in the 6th century BC began writing about the past in prose, they were noted for their innovation. They came to be known as iographers, or writers in prose. Figures of transition between the epic poets and the critical historians, they still recounted the careers of gods and heroes and legendary city founders. They were only proto-historians, but they took the first bold steps to free the community's recorded past from the tradition-bound framework of rhythm, verse, and song. And the historical spirit was born in the prosaicizing of experience. All the muses were originally goddesses of song, and only later did they become identified with different kinds of poetry, arts, and sciences. Homer, unclear about the number of muses, sometimes spoke of one, at other times spoke of many. He described them, accompanied by Apollo's lyre, singing to the gods banqueting on Olympus. Hesiod, who wrote after Homer, did distinguish 9 muses, but their specific roles came later. Quote, "We know how to tell falsehoods like the truth," the muses warned Hesiod, "and we know when we choose how to speak the truth." End of quote. Centuries later, Aristotle still gave poetry a higher dignity than history. Quote, "It really lies in this. The one describes what has happened, the other what might. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and more serious than history. For poetry speaks of what is universal, history of what is particular." End of quote. To prefer the particular to the universal, the sobering fact to the exhilarating myth, required both courage and self-denial. And this ends part 2 of chapter 69.